Welcome to the Athletic Perspective Podcast. I'm the host, Mike Jorgensen, and thank you for tuning in. This introductory episode is going to provide some context for the listener around who I am, what this podcast is about, as well as the value that listeners can get from it. And joining me today is Dr. Fergal O'Hagan. Fergal is a close friend of mine and mentor and is going to help by asking questions about the podcast to help listeners better understand what it's about. So a big welcome to Fergal, and let's get this started. So Fergal is a senior lecturer in the Department of Psychology at Trent University. He teaches courses in behavior modification, motivation and emotion, and research and statistics to undergrad and graduate students. He also conducts research on members of the sporting community and how their beliefs affect how they approach concussion prevention and management. In addition to that, he's also the mental skills coach for the Trent men's varsity rugby squad. Fergal provides coaching to the team and individual athletes on how to understand themselves better as performers and develop skills and perspectives that will help them perform better on and off the field. So thank you for joining me here today and coming on to chat a bit about the podcast.
Yeah, you're welcome, Mike. I'm really excited to be involved, and I think this is a really needed thing for the sport community, where we can start to get some of the insights that we've gained from sports science research out into the field in a very usable way.
So do you want to just share a little bit about yourself beyond what I said and about your role on this episode in particular?
Sure. Like, how far back?
As far back as you want.
Well, I guess where I'd start with
It all began, yeah.
Where I'd start with my involvements in athletics, I guess, as a kid, I enjoyed athletics because it gave me lots of opportunities to interact and relate with your friends. I found the training to be very absorbing, and I always loved practicing skills and mastering skills, and I liked the fact that I was kind of choosing my path in a sense.
Right.
And I grew up in Saskatchewan, played lots of different sports, small town, hockey obviously being probably prime.
Yeah.
But then went on to play individual sports like tennis. Loved contact, so played rugby, gridiron football in high school, and with varying ability, I would say.
Yeah.
Across the different sports I played, and I was very interested in kind of reflecting on my own experiences and how my own performance was affected, for example, with the kind of mental attitude that I went into competition with, and kind of realized that it certainly affected things, but I was always curious about, well, how can I influence that? Like, how can I influence my performance through my own psychology that I was bringing to the game, basically, right? Top 2 inches. And so that's where my interest in sports psychology sort of came up, and I went on to coach. I coached the Trent men's varsity team as a head coach for a number of years, coached at men's club rugby, coached kids, and so I had the opportunity to influence athletes, and my involvement with Trent men's rugby as a mental skills coach came about through the previous head coach, David McCulley. David took a very whole athlete perspective to performance and athlete development. He asked me to come on board to provide guidance specifically with mental skills. And so I continue to do that now with Tom McLeod, who's the head coach with Trent Men's Rugby.
Have you coached any other sports beyond rugby?
Yeah, coached tennis, coached a bit of hockey. Interestingly, I wound up coaching my little brother's baseball team, which I know nothing about baseball, but no one else wanted to do it, and they wanted to play. So it was like, okay, let's go, guys.
Someone had to step up.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've always enjoyed that part of it, right? And I guess my gig is really developing human potential,
right?
Because my previous life prior to being an academic and a prof, I worked as a rehabilitation clinician for quite a number of years, and that was basically helping people move from a state of ill health and dysfunction and get back into their lives, like re-engage with their work and their families and the things that they enjoy doing, despite the fact that they continued to experience ongoing problems with pain or fatigue or depression or what have you, right?
So that's a really kind of holistic approach to health too, then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually what I think we'll go on to talk about, maybe not so much in this episode, but in the next one, is a lot of the approaches that we take in the rehab clinic transfer to what we're doing with athletes. Yeah.
So I'll give a little bit of background about myself. So again, my name is Mike Jorgensen. I'm a PhD student, new PhD student starting next month at the University of Toronto in exercise science. I have a Master's of Science in Health and Sports Psychology. Fergal was actually my research supervisor. My area of research is around sport-related concussion, specifically attitudes and intentions towards risk behaviors in the context of injury prevention and concussion management. Beyond that, I'm also an athlete. I played on the Trent Men's varsity rugby team for a number of years, as well as the Fergal O'Hagan senior men's. I'm also an avid downhill skier, so I've done that since almost as soon as I started walking. I was put on skis, and I, similar to what Fergal was saying, I feel like that's really one of the reasons why I've become so interested in this area of research and why I've sought out opportunities in this area of academia. Is really driven through my interest and involvement in sport. So some of my background or my previous research specifically around concussions it developed directly as a result of some experiences I had and experiences that friends of mine had, and that was something that spurred my interest in this area around concussion in particular. And so as I move through into my PhD, I hope to continue exploring different aspects of that. Hopefully using this podcast as a bit of an avenue to chat with other folks involved in sport about their research and their background and so forth.
Yeah, so I guess, Mike, what I might see myself as here is sort of the occasional visitor, bit of an interloper, coming in and perhaps providing commentary or helping you set things up in terms of the podcast, right?
Mm-hmm.
Along those lines, what is this podcast about? First of all, how did you come to get the idea to start something like this?
I was recommended that I listen to a podcast. I never really listened to them before, and actually there was the one recommendation that you made, the behavioral observation, and
right,
to help with the course that I was teaching at Trent, and I think that really spurred my interest in this idea of this is such a fantastic form of media that we can present information through, and I see there's so many podcasts on every topic imaginable, and since then I've burned through a number of different podcasts, and I think it's great. So that, like, very initially, like at its roots, my interest sort of stemmed from that. But to be honest, it's been a bit of a passion project, I'd say, in terms of why this podcast, why this topic, being able to connect with folks in my field, I think is really critical. But as an academic, I find that many people that I interact with in sport really share their frustration at how inaccessible research can be to those not in academia. whether that's in terms of complex theories or wording used to describe stuff, or even something as simple as a paywall or journal subscription requirements. All of that creates barriers to the knowledge and information that people, coaches and athletes and trainers and even parents are interested in. And so at a very basic level, myself as an academic and working within the academic institution, I think given that it is a publicly funded institution, we have a bit of a responsibility to ensure access and sharing of the information that we generate. And so I see this podcast as an avenue for translating some of that higher end technical stuff. And so my intention with this podcast is really to connect the theory and the practice by having athletes and researchers such as yourself on to share their knowledge and their expertise with the listeners.
Okay. So what you're saying is that there's sort of this two separate communities, the sports science community and the athlete, performer and coach and those people, and they're not necessarily well connected, but you'd like to bridge that using the podcast as a medium, eh?
Yeah, I don't necessarily want to say they're not connected. For instance, you and I both do research, but we're also both athletes and coaches and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And so being in the positions we are, I think, we're in a very good position to be that champion of knowledge translation.
Yeah. So kind of bring those things together.
Mm-hmm.
I think, from my experience with podcasts, I think they're a great medium. You can do so many different things and get so many voices at the table. I think it's really a really great initiative. Yeah.
Well, and that's really what I want, and where I think this podcast in particular stands out. There's a lot of other sports science podcasts that exist, but I don't know, I don't want to say all, but a lot of them still discuss the content in a way that's not really accessible to a non-specialist audience. On the other end of things, those that do at a very basic level often are in the form of athlete interviews, and I think they're limited in the scope of experience in that realm.
Right.
And so I think this podcast fits very nicely in between those two, because again the emphasis is ensuring that the voice of the athlete and those involved in sport is present when discussing these scientific topics. Right.
So you want to get beyond the anecdotes.
Yeah.
And bring in some of the science, sports science, what we know about performance,
mm-hmm.
and how to enhance it and maintain that experiential kind of
so really
element, eh?
Yeah, use that as a platform to build the discussion.
Well, they get the lived experience, I guess, of what you're talking about, and so it is more relatable for sure. Because when we're talking about things, like for example, when we're talking about how our minds work in performance situations, for example, we've all experienced that, right? And so what is being explained should have some relationship to people's experiences.
Absolutely. And I think the anecdotes that you mentioned, like, they serve a really important purpose in doing that. But I think we, looking beyond and maybe even challenging some of the experiences,
sure,
or perceptions around those experiences, to say, does the science actually say this? Yeah,
and well, I'll tell you right now that when we talk about things like mindfulness, and when we talk about this sort of agenda in sports psychology, some of that's going to come through. Yeah. So who is the intended audience?
I think anyone who has any interest in sport could find value or interest in this podcast. For example, a researcher might find it valuable to hear an athlete's experience within a particular domain that they look at. Right. Or an athlete might want to learn more about the science behind some of what they do, what their training regimes and nutrition and injury management and so forth, or even just hearing other athletes share their experiences. A coach might be interested in learning how to apply some of the techniques and topics that we cover, or whether that's something they add to their toolbox or not, just learning more about that. even those who aren't involved in that aspect, but just a fan, depending who we're able, what guests we have, they might be inclined to tune in just to hear some of the banter and fun experiences that the athletes are willing to share with us.
Sure, yeah, and I suppose, gain some more insight themselves into what's going on in sports science. And,
yeah.
And so is it just for elite performers and elite coaches?
Not at all. I don't think it needs to be specifically high performance. Just anybody who's involved at any level, I think, will find value in it, because that's what resonates to me so much about sport, is just the ethos of sport culture and physical activity. It's something that just enriches everybody's lives. It doesn't matter if you're doing that as a child, learning to put on his skates and get out on the ice, or a high-level Olympian who's fighting for a gold medal. That's that passion is still there regardless. And that's the passion that individuals have for sport that I think resonates with me so much at a very personal level. And like I said, that's why I decided to continue my studies in this area. And I think that's something that others can get from this podcast too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because sport really is such a big part of our human experience.
Culturally, mentally, physically, like so many aspects of it.
Yeah, and if you look at how sport is approached too, it's kind of, it can be very much approached as a package. I think there's a danger when we start to dissect things and break things down into their minutia, that we lose the perspective of the whole, right? But I think sport can help us bring that together and look at performance and influences on performance that can transfer to other spaces, right? Like, for example, if you look at some of the principles and things used to enhance sport performance, that can transfer to business organizations. Working in teams, even individual performance in the workplace and such. So what should the audience then expect to hear?
Yeah, so I think the focus is ensuring that each episode is going to have some sort of voice of the athlete. So ideally have an athlete guest and a researcher in each episode, whether that's, I say athlete, but that might be a coach or potentially a trainer too, depending.
Like a sport community member.
A sport community member, yeah.
Sure.
As well as that research side. And so in doing so, I think the conversation, you're getting both those perspectives. And so the questions will be guided around a particular area of research. For instance, the one we're doing in the next episode, we'll be talking about mental skills with athletes and some of the work you do with the Trent team. I want to be talking about some of my concussion research as well, and potentially around doping in sport, team leadership. So I think it's pretty wide-ranging from behavioral, psychological, sociocultural, biophysical, like all of those sort of realms. I would hope to bring in. Sort of all of those different perspectives. If you had one way to describe the podcast, it is the sports science with those who play it. The science of sport with those who play. Those who play being athletes or any individual within that sporting community or group of individuals, and then that sports science being that research perspective.
Cool.
So thank you for coming on, and we'll end it there, and we'll get started. We'll chat about the next episode on mental skills.
Awesome. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, thanks, Fergal.
Okay.